I never thought the person who gave me life would be the one to try to take everything from me. Yet there I was, sitting in a sterile courtroom, my hands trembling on my lap, while my mother, the woman who had raised me, accused me of being mentally unfit. My stomach churned, my heart raced, and I could feel my entire world tilting on its axis. She spoke with chilling calm, like she had rehearsed every word, painting me as unstable, irrational, incapable of handling my own affairs. The courtroom felt suffocating, the walls closing in, every whisper of the gavel a countdown to my supposed humiliation. I looked at her, really looked, and saw no mother in her eyes, only cold calculation, the kind of cruelty you hear about in true crime stories. Disbelief crashed over me. How could someone who swore to protect me now work to destroy my reputation, my independence, my life? The air was thick with tension as I tried to speak, but every word seemed to vanish before reaching anyone's ears. I noticed the smirk on her face whenever I faltered, every glance she cast at the judge, daring me to break. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying her words over and over, feeling the sting of betrayal sharpen with each memory. I questioned myself constantly. Had I really done something to deserve this? Or was this just her way of gaining control, rewriting reality in her favor? I thought about the last 10 years, the moments I trusted her implicitly, the times I confided in her about my life, my hopes, my fears, and now, it all felt like ammunition for her twisted game. I remembered my childhood, how she had always been controlling, masking it as love. The little manipulations, the constant undermining of my confidence, the gaslighting, everything suddenly made sense. Yet the betrayal cut deeper than any logic could explain. She had carefully built a narrative where everyone, including my closest family, would see me as incapable, fragile, unstable. I was terrified that some part of the truth might get lost in the noise of her lies. I kept telling myself to stay calm, but inside, I was a storm of fear and anger, a whirlwind of disbelief that this woman, my own mother, was attempting to legally erase my autonomy. The courtroom was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that presses on your chest and makes every second feel like hours. I glanced at the judge, an older woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, sharp, observant, unflinching. I wondered if she saw through my mother's carefully rehearsed facade. My mother, in her perfectly tailored suit, voice steady as a metronome, didn't even glance at me. I felt invisible, like a character in someone else's story, a story I didn't recognize and couldn't escape. The betrayal wasn't just emotional. It was methodical, procedural, and I felt powerless, pinned by the weight of someone else's manipulation. I remember my lawyer whispering in my ear, telling me to stay composed, answer clearly, let the truth shine. But staying composed felt impossible. My mind raced through every possible scenario. What if she succeeded? What if I lost control of my own life? I recalled every fight, every argument where I stood my ground, only for her to twist it into evidence against me. I thought of the nights I cried silently, the sleepless nights questioning my sanity. Yet somewhere deep inside, a tiny ember of resolve flickered, a stubborn insistence that this was not the end of my story. Then, after what felt like an eternity of accusations, the judge leaned forward and asked one simple, piercing question that cut through the tension like a knife. My mother froze for the briefest moment, her confident mask slipping ever so slightly. That question lingered, a weight I had carried my whole life without realizing it. And I felt it, the possibility that truth still had a place here. Every eye in the courtroom turned to me. My hands still shook, but my mind started to clear. I began to see the situation not just as a trap, but as a puzzle I could solve. Every lie my mother told, every manipulative word, every attempt to undermine me, it was all laid bare, like pieces waiting to be turned in my favor. Fear still coiled in my chest, but it was no longer paralyzing. A new emotion rose, determination. The determination to protect myself, reclaim my dignity, expose the truth in a way that left no room for manipulation. I wanted the world to see her for who she really was. Not just my mother, not just the woman who raised me, but the person who could betray her own child so coldly. And I knew in that moment, the fight wasn't about anger. It was about strategy. Every word I would speak, every move I would make, had to be precise. This was no longer just about defending myself. It was about reclaiming my story, my life, my identity. The courtroom, once suffocating and oppressive, now felt like a battlefield, and I was ready to engage with my mind, my heart, and every ounce of strength I had. The judge's eyes held me, calm but unyielding, and for the first time that day, I felt seen. That one question might change everything, not just for the case, but for the control my mother had always tried to exert over me. I replayed her words, analyzed her tone, her pauses, her confidence. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began to map out the strategy that would shift power in my favor. This wasn't just defending myself anymore. It was about turning the tables in an undeniable, elegant, and emotionally satisfying way. I remembered all the little ways she tried to weaken me over the years. Subtle digs at my career, constant questioning of my judgment, gaslighting at family gatherings, making me doubt my own perceptions. All those attempts had trained me, forced me to develop patience, to observe, to notice patterns, to learn the art of strategy in silence. My vulnerability had become my greatest weapon, because no one expected the quiet, calculating strength now stirring inside me. Before the next hearing, I closed my eyes and pictured the outcome I wanted, not revenge through anger, but through truth. I imagined my mother confronted with her own lies, her manipulations exposed so clearly that even those she trusted would see her for who she really was. I imagined my life untouched by her control, my dignity intact, her attempts to dominate me powerless. That vision became my anchor, guiding me through the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm me. It wouldn't be easy. There would be moments of doubt, moments when her charm and manipulation could sway others, moments when I questioned my own strength. But deep inside, I felt clarity, a sense that the universe balances things, allowing justice to emerge when patience and intelligence are applied. The betrayal had wounded me, yes, but it also taught me to see through illusions, recognize patterns, and prepare for a payoff that would be both satisfying and transformative. Even in that vast, imposing courtroom, feeling small, I felt the first flickers of empowerment. I began to strategize silently, noting every detail of her testimony, every inconsistency, every exaggeration. I knew I had to stay calm, composed, articulate. Every emotional breakdown she tried to provoke had to be absorbed, transformed into quiet observation. I felt my internal narrative shift, from fear to resolve, from confusion to tactical clarity. The woman who once seemed omnipotent in her control over me was about to find out that I was not the fragile child she had always underestimated. The next morning, I arrived at the courthouse before anyone else. The corridors were cold, echoing with footsteps and distant murmurs. I clutched my notes in my hand, a tangible reminder that I had prepared, that I wouldn't crumble under her accusations. My mother was already there, sitting with that same rigid composure, her eyes scanning the room as if she owned it. I felt the familiar pang of anger, but instead of letting it consume me, I focused on the tiniest details, the way her hands trembled ever so slightly when she thought no one was looking, the imperceptible hesitation before she answered her lawyer's questions. These subtle cracks were my breadcrumbs, the clues that would eventually unravel the story she had carefully constructed. As the hearing began, the tension was almost unbearable. The judge's voice was steady, authoritative, demanding attention. But I could feel the weight of my mother's accusation pressing against me, threatening to suffocate me with every passing minute. She recounted stories from my past, twisting facts, emphasizing my supposed emotional instability, weaving a narrative where I seemed erratic, impulsive, and unfit. Every word cut deep, but I didn't respond immediately. I let her speak. I let her reveal the full extent of her strategy because, in doing so, she was giving me everything I needed to dismantle her lies. My lawyer nudged me gently, reminding me to stay composed. I nodded, my heart racing, my mind working overtime. I thought back to the nights I had spent questioning myself, wondering if I was overreacting, imagining betrayals that weren't real. And now, staring at her in the courtroom, I realized how methodical she had been. Every emotional slight, every whispered doubt she planted in my life, was part of a larger scheme to make me appear incapable. Yet, as I observed her, a strange calm settled over me. I understood her patterns now. I had studied her silently for years, and I knew that her greatest strength, her ability to manipulate, was also her greatest weakness, because it relied on the assumption that I would remain naive. The judge asked another question, one that required me to speak about my day-to-day responsibilities, my decisions, and how I managed my personal affairs. I took a deep breath. My lawyer nudged me gently, reminding me to stay composed. I nodded, my heart racing, my mind working overtime. I thought back to the nights I had spent questioning myself, wondering if I was overreacting, imagining betrayals that weren't real. And now, staring at her in the courtroom, I realized how methodical she had been. Every emotional slight, every whispered doubt she planted in my life, was part of a larger scheme to make me appear incapable. Yet, as I observed her, a strange calm settled over me. I understood her patterns now. I had studied her silently for years, and I knew that her greatest strength, her ability to manipulate, was also her greatest weakness, because it relied on the assumption that I would remain naive. The judge asked another question, one that required me to speak about my day-to-day responsibilities, my decisions, and how I managed my personal affairs. I took a deep breath, letting my voice rise steadily and calmly, narrating my life with honesty and clarity. I described how I ran my household, managed finances, balanced work and family, and made decisions affecting not just me but those I cared for. I spoke with quiet authority, each word carefully chosen, each sentence reinforcing the reality my mother desperately tried to obscure. I could feel her tension growing with each statement, her polished facade starting to falter as the truth became undeniable. Outside the courtroom, my thoughts drifted to the countless times she had humiliated me in front of family and friends. I remembered the whispered criticisms at dinner parties, the subtle undermining of my accomplishments, the gaslighting that made me doubt my memory and judgment. The memories stung, but instead of breaking me, they fueled me. I realized that all her attempts to control me had inadvertently trained me to observe, analyze, and anticipate. I had learned patience, the value of timing, and the importance of using intelligence over anger. And now, sitting in that room, I could finally channel that training into a strategy that would expose her with precision. As the hearing progressed, I noticed a subtle shift in the courtroom atmosphere. The judge's gaze, once neutral, now lingered on my mother with quiet scrutiny. Every time my mother tried to interject or assert dominance, the judge's calm, measured responses cut through her bravado. I felt a surge of hope. I realized that the balance of power was beginning to shift. And in that moment, I understood that this battle wasn't just legal, it was psychological. It was about who could maintain composure, read the other's intentions, and present truth with unwavering clarity. During a brief recess, I sat alone in the waiting area, my mind racing with possibilities. I thought about all the strategic moves I could make, the evidence I could subtly present, and the way I could guide the narrative without seeming defensive or reactive. I remembered her overconfidence, her belief that she could outsmart everyone. That arrogance was my advantage. I began planning how to reveal her lies, not with fury, but with calculated precision that would leave no room for doubt. I imagined watching her manipulation crumble under the weight of indisputable facts, her reputation exposed, her control evaporated. When the hearing resumed, I was ready. I answered questions with a calm clarity that surprised even me. I shared small but telling details about my life, details that contradicted her claims, details that highlighted her inconsistencies. I noticed her hands tightening around her papers, her eyes darting nervously, the subtle tension in her posture. I realized the first crack had appeared, and I would continue to widen it, slowly, carefully, until her entire facade collapsed. The emotional manipulation she had used for years, making me feel small, incapable, invisible, had fueled a quiet resilience within me. Each memory of humiliation, each sleepless night, had built an inner strength I hadn't recognized until now. I could feel it rising with each response I gave, a steady, unshakable force. The courtroom, once a place of fear and dread, now became a stage where I could reclaim my voice, assert my truth, and expose the betrayal that had haunted me for so long. I began to weave my narrative strategically, letting subtle contradictions in her story surface naturally. I spoke about moments she had twisted, emphasizing my recollection of events without aggression, allowing her lies to highlight themselves by contrast. The judge leaned forward, attentive, asking follow-up questions that further revealed inconsistencies. I could see my mother's composure cracking, the controlled mask slipping, her smirk fading into a tense, almost panicked expression. And for the first time, I realized the tide had turned. Every ounce of fear I had felt that morning, every tremor in my hands, every sleepless night filled with self-doubt, now transformed into purpose. I was no longer the vulnerable child she tried to depict. I was a woman reclaiming her story, armed not with anger, but with clarity, evidence, and emotional intelligence. The betrayal had been profound, but it had awakened a resourcefulness and resolve I didn't know I possessed. In that courtroom, in those moments of high-stakes tension, I saw the beginnings of a victory, not just for the legal outcome, but for my dignity, my autonomy, and my sense of self. The final day of the hearing arrived, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. I walked in, my heart steady, my hands no longer trembling, but my mind razor-sharp. My mother sat across from me, her eyes scanning the room with the same cold calculation I had seen from the start. But this time, I noticed subtle signs of unease. The slight twitch of her jaw, the brief hesitation before she answered, the way her eyes darted whenever the judge's gaze lingered. I realized that the careful web of lies she had spun over years was beginning to unravel, thread by thread, in front of the very person she had underestimated, me. The hearing began, and my mother launched into her prepared statements, her voice controlled and confident. But I was ready. I let her speak, listening intently, noting every exaggeration, omission, and tiny contradiction. I could feel my pulse steady as I silently cataloged each point I would use, each detail I would expose, each lie I would unravel. It was almost cinematic, the predator becoming aware that her prey was no longer helpless, that the roles had shifted, and the balance of power had subtly but irrevocably moved in my favor. When my turn came to speak, I did so calmly and deliberately, with the poise that comes from sleepless nights of reflection and quiet strategy. I described my life, my decisions, my responsibilities, with absolute clarity. I brought up examples my mother had distorted, highlighting the truth without malice, letting the facts speak louder than any accusation she could throw. I watched as her confidence wavered, subtle cracks in her facade impossible to hide. Then, with surgical precision, I revealed the evidence she had overlooked, the emails she had deleted that my careful record-keeping preserved, the witnesses who remembered events differently, the subtle manipulations she had employed that even the judge could see. Each revelation landed like a controlled, precise strike, exposing the truth buried beneath layers of deception. The judge leaned forward, her expression calm but sharp, asking questions that cut to the heart of the matter. My mother tried to respond, but her carefully rehearsed narrative fell apart under scrutiny. Every contradiction, every inconsistency, every attempt to gaslight me was now visible to everyone in the room. I could feel her realization dawning. The child she had tried to portray as fragile and incapable had outmaneuvered her, anticipated every move, and quietly built a defense that was precise, methodical, and unstoppable. There was a moment, a brief pause, that seemed to stretch forever. The judge's eyes met mine, a look of recognition passing silently between us, as if she understood the psychological battlefield we had navigated. I felt a deep, almost intoxicating sense of vindication, knowing that the truth I had carried in my heart all these years had finally emerged, undeniable, unshakable. My mother's smirk, once so full of confidence, had vanished, replaced by tension she could not hide, a silent acknowledgement of defeat that required no words. As the verdict was delivered, a wave of relief, triumph, and quiet satisfaction washed over me. The court recognized my competence, my stability, my right to maintain control over my own life. The manipulation, the betrayal, the years of subtle psychological warfare, all had been laid bare and addressed. I felt a profound sense of closure, a release from the suffocating weight of her attempts to dominate me. Beyond the legal victory, There was an emotional payoff, a recognition that I had survived and outmaneuvered the person who sought to destroy me. Walking out of the courtroom that day, I felt different, stronger, wiser, more certain of my own worth. The betrayal had cut deeply, but it had also awakened a resilience I hadn't fully known I possessed. I thought about the quiet nights I had spent questioning myself, the sleepless hours filled with doubt and fear, and I realized that every one of those moments had prepared me, had trained me to notice subtleties, anticipate deception, and approach the situation with patience and intelligence. The revenge I had achieved wasn't violent or vengeful. It was psychological, strategic, undeniable. It was the triumph of truth, the restoration of dignity, the exposure of manipulation, and the reclamation of my life. In the weeks that followed, life began to settle into a new rhythm. My relationship with my mother shifted irrevocably, now marked by clear boundaries and mutual recognition of truth. Family members who had been swayed by her deception began to see her differently, understanding the depth of the betrayal and the integrity of my response. I felt a profound sense of liberation, a release from the emotional chains that had bound me for years. More than anything, I felt quiet, powerful satisfaction in knowing that I had faced one of life's deepest betrayals, navigated it with intelligence and grace, and emerged not just unbroken, but stronger, wiser, and more self-assured than ever. Sitting alone one evening, reflecting on the ordeal, I realized that the real victory had not been winning the court case. It had been reclaiming my narrative. I had taken back control over my life, my story, and my identity. I had turned fear into strategy, manipulation into clarity, and betrayal into empowerment. In that transformation, I found the deepest sense of emotional closure imaginable. I had survived, I had thrived, and I had proven, to myself and to the world, that no amount of deceit, manipulation, or betrayal could erase the truth of who I am. For anyone who has faced betrayal, who has been underestimated, manipulated, or made to feel invisible, know this: strength often grows quietly, in the shadows of doubt and pain. Justice isn't always dramatic, and revenge isn't always violent. But when patience, clarity, and intelligence come together, the payoff is undeniable, deeply satisfying, and wholly empowering. I had endured the unthinkable, outwitted the very person who tried to destroy me, and emerged with my dignity intact, my life reclaimed, and my spirit unshaken. That, more than anything else, is a victory no one can take away.